The year was 1871, a year of silent tragedies and forgotten histories. A time when old photographs captured pale faces staring into eternity, and families clung to faith as death claimed their children. It was a century drowning in superstition, when whispers of ghosts and forbidden languages carried through the cold night air. And it was in this unsettling history that one child's voice would echo with secrets no one should ever have known. Her name was Catherine Doyle. At first glance, Catherine appeared like any other child in her rural Irish village. Thin, pale, her dark eyes too old for her age. In the only surviving photograph, faded and cracked at the edges, she does not smile. She looks past the lens, as though she sees something the camera cannot. Look closely at that photograph. There is no innocence in her expression. Only silence. Only weight. And from that silence, she began to speak. Her words were not the chatter of a child. They were fragments of horror storytelling, whispered in the small hours when candlelight flickered against damp stone walls. Catherine spoke of things long forgotten. She revealed chilling secrets about families in the village, details that should have been lost in time. A mother wept when Catherine recited the last words of her dead son, words spoken in a forbidden language no child was ever taught. Another villager fainted when the girl described a mysterious disappearance from decades past, recalling eerie details of a child who had vanished without a trace. How could a child, barely 7 years old, know of such things? In those years, dark history and superstition walked hand in hand. Post-mortem photography had become common, families keeping disturbing images of their dead children, dressed in their Sunday clothes, eyes painted open to appear alive. To most, these photographs were haunting memorials. But to Catherine, they were not still portraits. She claimed she could hear them. She spoke of what the silent children whispered from beyond the grave. The villagers tried to explain it away. Some said she was gifted, perhaps chosen by God. Others whispered of something darker, something sinister that lingered in her bloodline. A hidden truth, a curse from a strange family long forgotten. But every time Catherine opened her mouth, another secret slipped out. A farmer's betrayal. A priest's sin. A child buried where no grave marker stood. Her words unsettled everyone. And yet, they listened. They leaned closer, desperate and horrified all at once, caught in the tension between faith and fear. History rarely records children like Catherine Doyle. They vanish in the margins, swallowed by time. But this child's voice was different. Too loud, too sharp, too dangerous. Because she spoke the one thing no one wanted heard, truth. And truth, in 1871, could destroy lives. The villagers began to fear her. They saw the way she stared into the shadows, the way her lips trembled as though repeating what only she could hear. Some swore she was speaking with the dead. Others claimed she had been touched by the devil himself. The line between haunted places and human cruelty blurred in her story. For in Catherine Doyle's world, there was no escape from the sinister past. Each revelation cut deeper, each secret more terrifying than the last. And soon, her words would not just disturb the quiet lives of her neighbors. They would bring consequences no one could contain. Her life had only just begun. But already, the shadows around her grew darker. What Catherine knew, she should never have known, and the chilling truth she was about to reveal would change everything. The village where Catherine Doyle lived was small, almost forgotten by the outside world. In 1871, rural Ireland was scarred by hunger and silence. The Great Famine was still a fresh wound, its shadows stretching across the land. Families whispered of lost children who had vanished in the fields, of strange families who buried their dead in secret, of haunted places that no one dared to approach after dusk. This was not a place of light. It was a place where the dead seemed closer than the living. The houses were low, built of stone and thatch, their walls damp from endless rain. The church bell tolled faintly on Sunday mornings, echoing across empty hillsides. Life was harsh, and grief was constant. Mothers clutched their children tightly, knowing how easily fever could steal them in the night. Fathers worked until their hands bled, yet hunger always seemed to return. It was in this village that creepy storytelling became more than entertainment. It became survival. Around firelight, families told tales of banshees who wailed outside the homes of the dying, of ghosts who lingered in abandoned cottages, of curses that traveled through bloodlines. Every family carried its own secrets. Every family had something to hide. Catherine Doyle grew up listening, watching, absorbing, and then she began to speak. The people of the village already lived in fear of the unseen. They believed in forbidden languages spoken only by spirits, and in eerie details carved into old stones that marked forgotten graves. They believed photographs could capture not just the image of the dead, but their very souls. Post-mortem photography, with its disturbing images of pale children dressed as though still alive, found its way even into this isolated place. Families who could barely afford bread would still pay a traveling photographer to freeze their dead child in one last portrait. Those photographs became relics of grief, hung on walls, hidden in drawers, stared at in silence. When Catherine looked at them, she did not see stillness. She claimed she could hear faint voices, whispers. Some villagers swore she described the exact words their dead children had once spoken. Others accused her of blasphemy. How could a girl so young, with no schooling, recite things no living soul should know? Her words spread like infection. But before Catherine's voice unsettled the entire community, the village was already drowning in a sinister past. Old women recalled vanished children whose names had been erased from parish records. They spoke of a strange family that once lived near the bog, their cottage abandoned after all 5 of their children disappeared in a single night. The door was found open, the hearth still warm, but the beds were empty. Some said the family had fled in shame. Others whispered they had been taken, swallowed by the land itself. That cottage still stood, half-rotted and leaning, a haunted place where no one dared to go. Even in daylight, its windows appeared black, its silence heavy. Catherine, however, was not afraid. She lingered near it, eyes fixed on the shadows inside. When asked what she saw, her reply chilled the villagers to their bones. They're still there, all of them. Life in 1871 demanded silence. The church demanded obedience. The people demanded conformity. Secrets were buried deep, never spoken aloud. But Catherine's presence cracked that fragile order. Her whispers carried hidden truths into the open. Imagine the unease of a villager staring at a faded photograph of a dead child, only to hear Catherine speak the very words the child had once cried before death. Imagine a family hiding a forbidden language spoken only in hushed tones generations earlier, and hearing Catherine repeat it with unnatural fluency. The villagers began to watch her closely. They marked the way she avoided looking directly at the priest, or how she would turn suddenly toward empty doorways, as if something unseen had passed through. Rumors spread like fire. Some claimed she had been born under a cursed star. Others believed she carried the blood of witches from centuries past, when women were burned for knowing too much. A few whispered she was a vessel for the dead, an innocent child carrying the weight of countless souls. But there was another fear, darker still. What if Catherine was not just repeating secrets? What if she was revealing them? The village carried sins that no one wanted unearthed. A girl drowned in a well, a boy buried without a coffin, a father who disappeared after a drunken fight, his body never recovered. These stories lingered in hushed tones, but Catherine's voice gave them shape again. She spoke of unsolved mysteries no one dared revisit. She repeated eerie details that matched hidden truths only the guilty could have known, and in doing so, she drew suspicion upon herself. The villagers began to see her not as a child, but as something else, something dangerous, a mirror reflecting their sins. One evening, after Mass, a woman was overheard muttering, "She is not one of us. She belongs to them, the ones lost in time." The word spread. By winter, Catherine Doyle was no longer a little girl in their eyes. She was an omen, a warning, a curse that walked among them. And soon, her voice would tear open wounds that had been buried for decades. Because the village of shadows was not prepared for the chilling secrets Catherine was about to speak aloud. It began quietly. With words so small, so fragile, they might have been overlooked had they not carried a weight far too heavy for a child to bear. The year was still 1871. Catherine Doyle was only 7 years old. The village still saw her as a peculiar child, one who lingered too long in silence, her dark eyes searching corners where no one else dared to look. But one autumn evening, as the mist settled low over the fields, she opened her mouth, and the village would never be the same again. Her first words of strangeness came at a neighbor's cottage. A man had been found dead days earlier, collapsed suddenly in his fields. The villagers said it was his heart, or perhaps a punishment from God. They gathered in mourning, candles burning beside his body laid out in the front room. Catherine, small and pale, stood among them. She whispered softly, but everyone heard. He didn't die in the field. He died inside. On the stairs, he fell. His head hit the stone, and someone moved him. The room froze. No one had told her the man's body bore a wound at the back of the skull. No one had spoken aloud of the blood stain half hidden on the stone steps. Only those who had lifted him knew. Yet the child's words described it in eerie detail, an unsettling history exposed by lips that should not have known. The widow gasped. The priest demanded silence. But Catherine only stared at the still body, as though waiting for it to rise and confirm her story. From that moment, the village could no longer look at her as an innocent. Over the weeks that followed, Catherine spoke again, each time with a sharper edge. One day, she told a farmer's wife that her husband had another family, hidden across the boglands. She described the strange family in chilling detail, the names of the children, the color of their hair, the way they slept three to a bed. The woman, pale with shock, later confessed the story was true. Another evening, Catherine stood outside the churchyard staring at a row of headstones. She placed her hand upon the cold stone of a small grave. Without hesitation, she whispered a string of words in a forbidden language, a tongue no villager recognized. But one old woman understood. Tears welled in her eyes, for it was a fragment of a lullaby, an ancient song sung to a child who had died decades before. The villagers began to fear her, not just because she spoke the truth, but because her words carried eerie details no living soul should remember. In a world where dark history was always close at hand, Catherine's voice was more than unsettling. It was dangerous. Her words spread like wildfire, whispered in cottages and at market stalls. People crossed themselves when she passed. Mothers pulled their children away from her path. Some refused to speak her name at all, as if to say it aloud would summon her. Yet still, they listened, because her words revealed hidden truths, and the guilty feared what she might say next. The most disturbing of her early revelations came one rain-soaked night. Catherine was sitting by the hearth, her hair damp, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Without warning, she began to describe a mysterious disappearance from years before, a vanished child no one spoke of anymore. She told the story in fragments, her voice soft but unwavering. A boy, no older than herself, taken from his bed in the middle of the night. A shadow at the window. A mother's scream. And then, nothing but silence. The villagers sat in stunned horror. For they knew this story. It was the tale of young Patrick Callahan, who had vanished 20 years earlier. His body had never been found. The case was buried, a wound the village refused to reopen. But Catherine's words were different. She described not only his disappearance, but where he had been hidden. She spoke of the old well behind the blackthorn trees, the one no one dared to use. The next day, men gathered to investigate. They lowered a lantern into the depths of the well. The air was foul, the stones slick with moss, and though no body remained, they found fragments of bone, shards of cloth too small to deny. The villagers recoiled in terror, for Catherine had revealed a truth buried in darkness, and in doing so, she had disturbed the fragile silence that kept their world intact. From then on, Catherine Doyle's words were no longer dismissed as childish nonsense. They were feared. They were seen as curses, creepy storytelling that no one wanted to hear but could not turn away from. The priest called her a danger to the faith. The villagers whispered she had been touched by unholy forces. Some believed she was speaking with the dead, repeating what the restless souls had whispered into her ears. And yet, beneath all the fear, there was fascination. Catherine was becoming a living mystery, a child caught between two worlds. To look at her was to feel unease, as though gazing upon an old photo that revealed something you were never meant to see. She was no longer simply Catherine Doyle. She was the child who spoke secrets, the one who carried the voices of the dead, the one who shattered silence with truth. And as her words grew bolder, so did the danger that followed them, because some secrets should never be spoken aloud. By the winter of 1871, Catherine Doyle's voice no longer sounded like the voice of a child. To those who listened, it felt older, ancient, weighted with sorrow that should not belong to someone so young. It was said that when she spoke, her words carried an echo, like voices rising faintly from beneath the earth. Villagers began to avoid her during daylight, but at night, some crept to her family's cottage. They came not out of kindness, but out of desperation. Because Catherine was no longer just revealing secrets. She was repeating the whispers of the dead. It began with a mother who had lost her infant months before. The child's post-mortem photograph, eyes painted open, mouth stiffly closed, was kept hidden in a wooden box. She begged Catherine to look at it. The girl studied the photograph silently, her thin fingers tracing the faded edges. Then, without lifting her eyes, she began to hum. The tune was broken, fragile. A lullaby, the mother gasped. It was the very song she had sung to her child in his final hours, a melody no one else had heard. From that night forward, the villagers carried their old photos and their grief to Catherine Doyle. They placed them before her as though before an altar, and each time, she whispered things that should not have been possible. Last words, lullabies, secret phrases once spoken only in the ears of the dead. Some left her cottage trembling in awe. Others left pale, sickened, swearing they would never return. But they always returned. The girl's power, if power it was, began to consume the village. A widow brought Catherine the photograph of her husband, a man buried 3 winters earlier. Catherine stared at the image, her lips trembling. Then she spoke in a forbidden language, words the widow understood but had not heard in years. They were words whispered only between her and her husband, a secret code of love they thought no one else knew. The woman collapsed to her knees. She believed Catherine had truly spoken with the dead, but others whispered a different story, that Catherine was no child at all, but a vessel, that something sinister had entered her body and was using her mouth to spill what should remain hidden. The priest denounced her, warning the villagers that these were not the voices of God, but of demons. Yet when the same priest's own hidden sins began to emerge from Catherine's lips, details no one else could know, his sermons grew shorter, and his eyes avoided hers. One bitter night, Catherine was seen walking toward the abandoned Callahan cottage, the haunted place where 5 vanished children were said to linger. A group of villagers followed at a distance, too afraid to approach. They watched as she stood before the rotting door, her face pale in the moonlight. And then she began to speak, not in one voice, in many, high-pitched, low, broken, crying, laughing. She spoke as though 5 voices poured through her all at once. Words of hunger, words of fear, names of children long erased from parish records. The villagers fled in terror, swearing they had heard the voices of the vanished, swearing Catherine Doyle had become their mouthpiece. From that night forward, no one doubted the horror storytelling her presence brought. She was not only revealing secrets, she was dragging the dead back into the world of the living. And with every whispered truth, the danger grew. Some villagers now feared her more than any ghost. They believed she carried a curse, one that would bring ruin if left unchecked. Rumors spread that her family was cursed too, a strange family touched by darkness. Some called for Catherine to be taken to the priest, others muttered of harsher remedies whispered about in older, crueler times. But even as the villagers turned against her, they could not stay away. For Catherine had become the keeper of unsolved mysteries, the voice of the forgotten, the child who carried chilling secrets in every breath. And some villagers, though they trembled, wanted those secrets revealed. One evening, as the wind howled outside her cottage, Catherine sat staring at the flames of the fire. Without warning, she spoke again. She described the death of a man no one had mentioned for years, a man who had vanished, presumed lost to the bog. She spoke of how he had been struck, dragged, and hidden. She spoke of a name of a man still living. The cottage went silent. No one dared to breathe, and in that silence, Catherine's words cut deeper than any blade. The villagers now understood she was not merely repeating whispers. She was uncovering the hidden truth, truth that lived in shadows, truth that could tear their lives apart. The child who spoke the words of the dead had become a threat to the living, and soon someone would decide she had spoken enough. The whispers of Catherine Doyle did not stop. They spread through the cottages, across the fields, into every dark corner of the village. Secrets were no longer safe. The dead were no longer silent. And soon, all eyes turned toward the one man who was supposed to hold authority over both the living and the dead. The parish priest, Father Brennan, had served the village for nearly 30 years. He had baptized their children, buried their dead, heard their confessions. He was a figure of order in a place where chaos was always close. But now, his flock came to him with fear in their voices, demanding answers about Catherine Doyle. Was she blessed? Or was she cursed? Father Brennan was a stern man, rooted in the teachings of the church. He did not tolerate superstition. To him, the old tales of banshees and curses were remnants of pagan ignorance. Yet, even he could not ignore what the villagers described. Catherine had spoken words no child should know. She had repeated sins confessed in secrecy. She had described the final moments of the dead with unsettling accuracy. Each story arrived at the priest's doorstep like a dark offering, leaving him troubled in ways he could not explain. And then came the most damning claim of all. One evening, a widow whispered to him in tears that Catherine had spoken of his own private sin, an old weakness, a moment of shame he had never confessed to anyone. She said the girl had repeated his words exactly, as though she had been there with him in the silence of his thoughts. Father Brennan's hands shook as he dismissed her. But inside, fear gripped him like never before. The priest began to visit Catherine's family. He sat in their dim cottage, the smell of damp earth heavy in the air, and he studied the child. She sat by the fire, her face pale, her eyes distant. When he asked her questions about scripture, she gave simple answers, like any child. But when he pressed harder, demanding to know if she spoke with spirits, her lips trembled. "They come to me," she whispered. "They don't want to be forgotten." The words chilled him. He recited prayers, sprinkling holy water across the room. Catherine only watched, her eyes flickering toward the corners of the cottage as though shadows gathered there. The priest felt no relief. Instead, he left with an unease he could not shake. In the weeks that followed, Father Brennan found himself caught in a dilemma. If he condemned the girl as possessed, the villagers might turn violent, the history of which trials was not far removed. He knew what frightened men and women were capable of when they believed evil was in their midst. Catherine could be cast out, or worse. But if he accepted her as a vessel of divine truth, then his authority would collapse. For what use was a priest if a child could reveal sins, uncover hidden truths, and pierce the veil between the living and the dead? Every sermon he gave was heavy with fear. Every prayer was interrupted by the thought of her dark eyes fixed upon him. And still the villagers came, whispering their stories, begging for guidance. Some demanded Catherine be silenced. They spoke of curses, of danger, of the ruin her words could bring. Others, however, believed she was a gift, that God himself had chosen her to reveal secrets and punish the guilty. The village began to divide, half in awe, half in terror. Father Brennan stood between them, unable to choose a side. But Catherine did not wait for him to decide. One Sunday after Mass, as the villagers filed out of the church, Catherine lingered at the doorway. Her small figure stood in the shadow of the stone arch. The priest turned toward her, his face stern, ready to scold her for her strange presence. Before he could speak, Catherine whispered loudly enough for the gathered crowd to hear. "You hide them in the crypt." The church went silent. Her words fell like stones in the air. Everyone turned toward the priest. His face went pale. For in that moment, Catherine had spoken a truth no one else could have known. There was indeed something hidden in the crypt beneath the church, something only Father Brennan and God were supposed to know. The villagers stared at him with wide, suspicious eyes. The priest trembled, his lips moving in silent prayer. And Catherine only watched, her gaze steady, as though daring him to deny it. From that day on, Father Brennan could not escape her shadow. He grew gaunt, his sermons filled with warnings of demons, his voice shaking as he spoke of temptation and sin. Some said he feared the devil. Others said he feared Catherine Doyle. The mystery of her words became heavier, darker, more dangerous. For if even the priest could be shaken by a child's whisper, what hope did anyone else have? The village waited for his judgment, but none came. He was trapped, caught between faith and terror, unable to act. His silence became its own condemnation, and Catherine's words kept coming. The dilemma of Father Brennan was never resolved. Some claimed he lost his mind, muttering prayers to himself as he wandered the church at night. Others swore they saw him staring at Catherine from the shadows, as though she held his soul in her hands. One thing was certain: the priest who had ruled the village for decades was broken, and the girl who had spoken secrets no one should know had shattered the last line of defense between the villagers and their fear. For now, the whispers of Catherine Doyle were unstoppable, and the next secret she revealed would plunge the village into chaos. The crypt beneath the parish church had always been a place of silence. Its stone walls were damp, its air thick with the scent of earth and decay. Only the priest ever descended there, carrying lantern light into the darkness, tending to the remains of those laid to rest long ago. For the villagers, it was a place of reverence, a forbidden chamber where the past slept undisturbed. But Catherine Doyle's words had pierced that silence. "You hide them in the crypt." The moment she spoke, something shifted in the village. Suspicion spread like smoke. What had the priest hidden? And how could a child have known? Father Brennan tried to dismiss it, of course. He told the villagers that Catherine was merely a child, prone to fancies and lies. Yet the tremor in his voice betrayed him. The villagers noticed. They always notice when a man of God begins to falter. Whispers spread through the cottages. Had he committed some secret sin? Had Catherine uncovered the shame of their own priest? The villagers could not know the truth. They did not know that the crypt held more than coffins. It was said that years earlier, during a harsh winter, the village had been struck by fever. The dead multiplied so quickly that the ground could not take them fast enough. Desperate and fearful of plague, Father Brennan had sealed the bodies in the crypt, hidden from sight, stacked in shadows. He had prayed over them in secret, believing that silence would protect the living. But Catherine knew. She spoke of the crypt not as rumor, not as hearsay, but as if she had walked its narrow corridors herself. One evening, a group of villagers, driven by curiosity and fear, gathered at the church doors. They demanded Father Brennan open the crypt. His face turned pale, but he could not refuse. Lanterns were lit, iron keys rattled, and the great stone door groaned open with a sound like a dying breath. The villagers descended. What they found was worse than rumor. Row upon row of bodies lay in the shadows, stacked against the walls, their faces twisted in the agony of their final hours. Some still wore the tattered remnants of clothing. Others were reduced to little more than bone. The stench of old death rose like a curse, choking the air. The villagers recoiled in horror. Mothers clutched their children. Men muttered prayers beneath their breath. And Catherine, who had followed silently, only whispered, "I told you." From that night, the village could not rest. The crypt was no longer a place of holy silence, but a pit of dread. People swore they heard sounds rising from beneath the church, scratches on stone, faint voices calling in the night. Lanterns flickered in cottages, and no one dared walk past the churchyard after dark. Some believed the spirits of the forgotten dead had been disturbed. Others whispered that Catherine herself had stirred them awake. But one thing was certain: the secret should never have been revealed. Catherine grew stranger in those weeks. Her voice, once soft and childish, seemed to deepen at times, carrying a weight far older than her years. She would pause mid-sentence, as though listening to voices no one else could hear. Sometimes she spoke of things she could not possibly know. The names of ancestors buried decades before, the hidden feuds between families, the quiet sins carried to the grave. One villager recalled how Catherine stood by the well and whispered a name, the name of a man long dead, whose bones rested in the crypt. She then described, in chilling detail, the manner of his death, a truth no one had ever spoken aloud. The family of the man wept in silence, for every word she said was true. It was as if the dead themselves had chosen her tongue as their vessel. The village began to fracture. Some said Catherine was chosen by God, a prophet with divine sight. Others swore she was possessed, a tool of the devil. A few demanded she be taken from her home, cast out before more secrets spilled into the light. But no one could ignore her. Even those who feared her found themselves drawn to her, desperate for answers, terrified of silence. The priest, meanwhile, grew hollow-eyed and desperate. He prayed louder than ever, his voice echoing through the empty church at night. Yet even he could not shake the thought that Catherine Doyle had become a mirror, reflecting every hidden truth, every buried sin, dragging the past into the present. And when the past comes clawing out of the grave, peace is impossible. The most terrifying moment came when Catherine spoke of another secret. This time, it was not about the priest, nor the crypt. It was about a man still living. She whispered his name, an ordinary farmer, known to all, and then spoke of what he had done years ago in the forest, an act of cruelty buried so deeply that not even his wife knew. The man turned pale, shouting at her, denying every word. But his neighbors began to look at him differently. Doubt poisoned their eyes. Fear spread like rot. The farmer left the gathering that night, his steps unsteady. By morning, he was found dead at the edge of the fields. Some said it was his shame. Others said it was the weight of Catherine's words. A few whispered that the dead themselves had taken him. Either way, the village understood one thing. Catherine's secrets were no longer confined to the past. They were reaching into the present, tearing lives apart. The villagers had wanted the truth. They had demanded the crypt be opened, the silence broken. But now, they wished they could return to ignorance. For some truths, once spoken, cannot be buried again. And Catherine Doyle had become the keeper of those truths. Fear is a quiet thing at first. It lingers in whispers, in sidelong glances, in the way a mother clutches her child as a strange girl walks past. But fear does not stay quiet. Fear grows. Fear festers. And in the small Irish village of 1871, fear of Catherine Doyle was beginning to turn into something far more dangerous. The villagers had tolerated her strangeness for months. They had listened to her uncanny words, her chilling revelations, the eerie details of lives they believed safely hidden. But with each passing week, her secrets became sharper, more personal. And with every truth she spoke, another family felt the sting of shame. At first, they had called her the gifted child. Some even knelt before her, begging for answers, desperate to know what she might reveal of their dead. But now, the tone had shifted. She was no longer seen as chosen. She was seen as cursed. Catherine Doyle had become a threat. Look closely at the stories that spread in the village. They no longer told of Catherine as a strange girl. They told of her as a monster. A mother swore she had seen Catherine at her window in the dead of night, staring through the glass, whispering a language no one understood. A farmhand claimed the child had stood in the churchyard alone, speaking to the post-mortem photographs displayed in a grieving family's home, as though the dead inside the frames had answered her back. Truth or rumor no longer mattered. Fear had blurred the line. The parish priest, Father Brennan, grew desperate. He told the villagers that the girl was dangerous, that she had become a vessel of something unholy. He urged the people not to listen to her words, not to give her power through their fear. But the more he warned them, the more suspicion turned not just against Catherine, but against him as well. Hadn't she already uncovered his secret in the crypt? Hadn't she already revealed what he had buried? If Catherine was cursed, was the priest not cursed too? The village was no longer united in fear. It was fractured, and Catherine was at the center of that fracture. Children began to avoid her. They would cross the road when they saw her coming, whispering behind their hands. A group of boys once followed her down a path, throwing stones, calling her names: witch, devil child, ghost tongue. One stone struck her cheek, drawing blood. Catherine did not cry. She only stood still, her dark eyes locked on theirs. The boys fled in terror. By morning, one of them awoke screaming, claiming he had seen her standing at the foot of his bed, her lips moving though no sound came out. His mother swore the mark on his arm looked like a handprint. Rumors fed on rumors. The adults were worse. Some villagers demanded Catherine be taken away, sent to a convent, or locked in a poorhouse. Others whispered of more violent solutions. A drunken farmer declared in the tavern that the girl should be drowned in the river before more evil spilled from her mouth. His words sent a chill through the room, yet no one stopped him. No one contradicted him, because deep down they were thinking the same thing. The child who spoke secrets no one should know was no longer a curiosity. She was becoming unbearable. Catherine herself seemed to sense the change. Her silences grew longer. Her words, when spoken, were sharper, colder. She no longer warned the villagers of hidden sins or haunted truths. Instead, she spoke in riddles. She would walk past a home and murmur, "There is blood beneath your floor." She would glance at a man in the fields and whisper, "Your wife is not alone when you are gone." Perhaps she meant to protect. Perhaps she meant to warn. But the villagers no longer heard warnings. They heard threats. One night, a gathering was held in the church. Men and women crowded beneath the wooden beams, the flicker of candlelight throwing long shadows across the walls. Their voices rose in anger and fear. Some demanded Catherine be exorcised. Others wanted her sent far from the village. A few spoke words they had never dared utter before, that the child should not be allowed to live. Father Brennan tried to quiet them, his voice trembling with desperation. But he could not calm the storm, for once fear curdles into hostility, reason no longer holds sway. Outside, Catherine stood in the rain. Alone. Listening. She heard their voices, muffled by the walls of the church. She saw the way the shadows flickered inside, distorted, monstrous. And though she was only a child, she seemed to understand what they were planning. Some say she smiled. Others swear she wept. But none could deny that when she turned away and walked into the night, the air seemed to grow colder. The village that once feared Catherine now prepared to act against her. Fear had become hostility. Hostility was hardening into something more dangerous still. And with each passing day, the line between superstition and cruelty grew thinner. The question was no longer what secrets Catherine knew. The question was how far the village would go to silence her. The night the village turned was marked not by storms, nor by fire, but by silence. A silence so deep it seemed the air itself had been stolen away. Even the dogs refused to bark, as though they sensed what was coming. The year was still 1871, but for those who lived in that small, isolated place, it might as well have been the end of time. The villagers had gathered once more inside the church. Candles lined the altar, their flames trembling as if afraid. The heavy wooden doors had been locked, not to keep something out, but to trap something within. That something was Catherine Doyle. The priest had brought her in under the guise of prayer. Father Brennan claimed he would read sacred rites, that he would free the child of whatever unholy force spoke through her. But many of the villagers were not there to witness an exorcism. They were there to end the whispers once and for all. Catherine stood at the center of the nave, small and pale beneath the towering crucifix. Her black hair clung to her face, wet from the rain outside. She said nothing. Her silence unnerved them more than her words ever had. The priest began to pray, his voice echoing in the rafters. "Deliver this child from evil. Release her from the grip of darkness." But as the prayer rose, Catherine lifted her head, and in that moment, the church fell still. She began to speak, not in her child's voice, not in the innocent tones of a 7-year-old girl, but in a voice older, deeper, layered, as though a chorus of the dead had gathered inside her lungs. She named them, one by one, the men who had stolen, the women who had betrayed, the children buried in shallow graves outside the village. She spoke of forbidden language whispered by ancestors long gone, words that chilled the bones of all who heard them. She recited the hidden truths that no one dared utter, truths carried in shame, secrets that had festered in silence. The villagers trembled. Some fell to their knees, weeping. Others shouted at her to stop, covering their ears. But Catherine's words filled the church, unstoppable, relentless. Look closely at this moment. It was not simply a child speaking. It was as though every grave, every coffin, every forgotten photograph had found its voice through her lips. The dead were speaking. A woman fainted when Catherine described her infant, lost to fever, whose body had been hidden rather than buried properly. A man collapsed when she revealed the place where he had once hidden a terrible crime. And in the back of the church, an old farmer clutched his chest and fell dead as she spoke his name. Panic erupted. Some villagers screamed for the priest to silence her. Others demanded the doors be opened, desperate to flee. But Father Brennan stood frozen, sweat dripping from his brow, his faith crumbling with every word. For Catherine's final revelation was directed at him. She turned her gaze to the altar, to the trembling man who had baptized her. And she spoke. "You buried more than bones in the crypt." The words struck like a blade. The villagers turned to their priest, their trust shattered. What had he done? What truth had he hidden? Father Brennan fell to his knees, clutching his rosary. But the words did not stop. Catherine spoke of nights when he descended into the crypt alone, carrying burdens heavier than death. She revealed a sin buried beneath holy stone, one that no prayer could cleanse. The villagers recoiled. Their shepherd had become their wolf. Chaos consumed the church. Some cried out that Catherine was possessed, that the devil had taken her tongue. Others swore she was a prophet, a vessel of divine vengeance. But regardless of belief, one fact was undeniable. Catherine Doyle had revealed what was never meant to be spoken, and revelation is the most dangerous weapon of all. The candles flickered violently. Some swore the shadows in the rafters moved on their own, stretching, twisting. A sound like weeping rose from the crypt below. Others claimed the post-mortem photographs hanging in the priest's chambers shuddered on the walls, as if the dead inside them stirred at her voice. No one could agree on what truly happened in that moment, but all agreed on one thing. The village would never be the same. When Catherine fell silent, the silence was worse than the words. Her lips closed. Her eyes rolled back. She collapsed to the cold stone floor. The villagers rushed forward, some in pity, some in fear. But none dared touch her. And as Father Brennan stood above her, trembling, the truth of the night hung heavy in the air. Catherine Doyle had spoken every secret, torn open every grave, and revealed sins that had been buried for generations. The villagers now faced a choice: destroy the child or destroy themselves. And as they argued, as voices rose once more into rage and panic, Catherine's body stirred. Her lips parted, and a final whisper slipped into the air, soft but clear, cutting through the storm of voices like a blade. This is only the beginning. The night of revelation had come, but the true horror was still to follow. The night of revelation ended not with fire or blood, but with silence. A silence so heavy it smothered the air, pressing down on the village like a shroud. After Catherine Doyle's final words, "This is only the beginning," the church had erupted into chaos. Shouts, screams, the sound of splintering wood as people fought to leave. But by dawn, the chaos was gone. The village was quiet, too quiet. No one spoke of what had happened in the church. No one dared. The villagers went about their routines as though nothing had occurred. They drew water from the well. They tilled the fields. They lit their lanterns at dusk. But their eyes betrayed them, haunted, restless, avoiding one another in shame. The silence was not peace. It was fear, tightly wound, ready to break. And Catherine Doyle was gone. Some said she had fled into the forest during the night. Others swore the priest had taken her, smuggled her away under the cover of darkness. A few whispered that the villagers themselves had ended her life, though no one would admit it. Whatever the truth, Catherine had vanished. And with her absence came the silence. But silence is never empty. The village began to change. At night, mothers heard their children whispering in their sleep, speaking words they did not understand, phrases in the forbidden tongue Catherine herself had once uttered. Men working the fields claimed to hear voices on the wind, repeating names of the dead long buried. Women fetching water from the well swore they saw a pale figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching. It was Catherine's silence, but it was filled with echoes. Father Brennan was never the same. He still led Mass, but his voice cracked, his prayers thin and desperate. His eyes darted constantly to the church doors, as if expecting her to return at any moment. At night, villagers claimed to hear him shouting in the rectory, arguing with someone who was not there. Some swore he had locked himself in the crypt, speaking to the dead. Others whispered that he had gone mad, driven into darkness by Catherine's final revelation. The silence had broken him. Look closely at the village in those days. Post-mortem photographs hung heavier on the walls. The eyes of the dead, painted open, seemed sharper now, watching, judging. Families avoided them, yet could not take them down. They feared destroying the only connection to those who had passed. But in Catherine's absence, the photographs seemed louder. Some swore they heard faint voices when they walked past them. A child claimed one blinked. No one laughed at such tales anymore. The villagers had demanded silence. They had prayed for Catherine's voice to stop, but when her words were gone, they realized the horror had only deepened. For silence does not erase secrets. It only buries them deeper, and buried things have a way of clawing back into the light. Weeks passed, and the village remained locked in uneasy quiet. No travelers came. No letters were sent. It was as though the place had been swallowed by time, cut off from the outside world. Some families began to leave, fleeing in the night, abandoning their homes to rot. Others stayed, clinging to their land, even as dread settled into their bones. And yet, no one ever spoke Catherine's name aloud. It was as if she had been erased, lost in time. But the silence betrayed them. One night, a woman awoke to the sound of a child's voice outside her cottage. She rose, trembling, and looked through the window. There, in the pale moonlight, stood a small figure. Thin, pale, her eyes too old for her face. The woman fainted. By morning, she was gone. Her bed empty. Her door wide open. The villagers whispered, but never out loud. They knew who the woman had seen, and they knew what it meant. The silence had not saved them. It had cursed them. Catherine Doyle's voice was gone, but her presence lingered, woven into every shadow, hidden in every whispered rumor, etched into the silence itself. The villagers had demanded peace. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a quiet more terrifying than any scream. For silence, in Catherine Doyle's village, was not absence. It was a waiting. And as autumn winds howled through the empty fields, and the church bells tolled with no hand upon the rope, the villagers understood the truth. Catherine Doyle was gone, but her secrets were not. The year 1871 faded into memory, but the story of Catherine Doyle never left the village. Her disappearance was never explained. No body was found. No grave was marked. It was as if she had dissolved into the mist, carried away by the very secrets she spoke. But the silence she left behind was not peace. It was a haunting. Generations passed, and the cottages of that small Irish village crumbled into ruins. The people who once lived there fled, their bloodlines scattered across the land. But ask the locals who remain in nearby towns, and they will tell you, the place is cursed. The fields lie barren. The old church stands hollow, its bell long rusted, its crypt sealed shut. Yet at night, the stories say, you can still hear her. A child's voice, carried on the wind. Soft, whispering, speaking secrets no one should know. Look closely at the old photographs that survive from that village. Some are faded family portraits, others the grim post-mortem images so common in the 19th century. Children propped up in death, their eyes painted open, mothers holding lifeless infants in their arms. But there is one photograph that scholars argue over. It shows a group of villagers standing in front of the church in 1871. Their faces are grave, their bodies stiff. But in the corner of the image, barely visible, stands a small figure, thin pale, staring directly at the camera with dark eyes. Some say it was Catherine Doyle. Others insist the photograph was taken after she vanished. If that is true, then who, or what, was captured in that moment? History leaves gaps. It buries what it cannot explain. Catherine's story was never written in parish records. No priest confessed his part. No villager spoke her name again. The silence was complete. And yet, silence does not erase. It only delays. Legends of Catherine Doyle live on in fragments. A farmer who claimed to see her face in the well water before drowning. A priest who swore she whispered his sins in the confessional before he died. A child who vanished near the ruins of the village in 1923. His sister claiming she heard a girl's voice calling his name. These fragments piece together a truth more unsettling than any written history. Catherine Doyle was not forgotten. She was waiting. Think of the pattern. A child who spoke the words of the dead. A village that silenced her. A legacy of whispers that never ceased. Perhaps Catherine was a victim of her time, a child crushed by superstition and cruelty. Perhaps she was something more, a vessel chosen to bear the voices of the forgotten. Or perhaps, the most chilling possibility, she was both, a child and a curse, an innocent and a prophecy, lost in time, but never truly gone. As for the villagers, their fear became their undoing. They had wanted silence, but silence became their punishment. Each family that fled carried the weight of Catherine's words with them, never free of the secrets she revealed. And even now, those who claim descent from that place speak uneasily of strange dreams, of voices in the night, of a child's footsteps in empty halls. They say Catherine Doyle does not haunt places. She haunts people. So remember this, as you sit in the safety of your room, the light flickering on your screen. History is never just the past. It lingers. It clings. And sometimes it finds a voice. Sometimes that voice is a child's. The story of Catherine Doyle remains one of the great unsolved mysteries, a tale buried in the dark history of 1871, a story of forbidden language, haunted places, vanished children, and secrets that should never have been spoken. But the next time you hear a whisper in the dark, the next time you catch a glimpse of a face in an old photograph, ask yourself, is it only memory, or is it her? Because the silence that followed Catherine Doyle was never truly silence. It was a warning, and perhaps, even now she is still speaking. This has been the story of Catherine Doyle, the child who spoke secrets no one should know. 1871. But the dead do not always rest, and the past is never as far away as we like to believe. If you listen closely, you might still hear her voice.